So 2020 is coming to an end. I think a lot of people are cheering about that. It has been a tough year for a lot of people and a lot of people here in Toronto, not only with two major lockdowns, but the city also saw the retirement of the police chief, protests for racial equality. There's a lot to discuss. So let's bring in Mayor John Tory joining us now for the last time in 2020 for this sort of interview. Good morning to you, Mayor.
Hey, Mel, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. And first of all, I want to say thank you because you have always been really gracious with your time and joining us once or twice a week for these updates. And I really appreciate it. And I think Toronto residents do as well, just to keep them abreast of what's going on in the city. So thank you for that.
Well, I'll just say I think it's an important part of my job, frankly, is to try to inform people, and I try to answer the questions that were, multiple and have been throughout, and also to reassure people, because while this thing has been very, very disconcerting for all of us, including me, people needed reassurance that we had plans, we were implementing those plans, we were doing our best to keep people safe, and I think that's a big part of my job, as opposed to try to answer questions. And I learned a lot from doing these interviews, too. People would say, well, what are you doing about this, or is this program going to be continued? And I go back to City Hall and say, what is the answer to that question? So thank you for having me on. I think it's been very useful in terms of that kind of two-way communication.
Great. And I know we try to get a lot of our viewer questions on as well, so I try to include those in our interviews, including this. Yesterday in your news conference, you mentioned potentially further restrictions on a regional basis. And what have those talks been like? When could we potentially expect more? And also with that, where are the boundaries? Because when we look at the GTHA, is that enough to do a shutdown that way?
I think the answer to your last question is yes. I think the GTHA, though, may be the proper boundaries here. And I know there are people out there in Halton or Durham who don't like to hear that, but I think the fact is we are a region of some 7 million people. People move back and forth a lot every day to work, but also, when there are shutdowns and so on, they move back and forth to shop. They shouldn't, because they're asked to stay home, but they do. And so I think if we're going to do something effective over a period that is generally quieter, like over the Christmas period, that it should be region-wide. And I think it should really focus on just having as few places for people to go as possible, which means maybe just saying, look, the office towers in places where we have those in downtown Toronto and elsewhere, those will be closed. Because, frankly, most of them will be largely empty anyway of people, and that we should be working to really just make sure that as much as possible, like the spring. I mean, people don't have fond memories, I'm sure, of the spring, but it was effective in reducing the spread of COVID-19 because there was just no place that was really open.
Would you say that that message then consistent with schools and extending that holiday closure and moving to remote learning?
Well, I've made my own views on that known, and I'm not a medical expert, nor am I in charge of the school board. But I have said that I thought that a pause of some kind after Christmas, perhaps switching over to virtual learning, and I have no idea why we don't, in fact, extend the school year into July by 10 days, and it gives us then the flexibility to do this. And I know two things, Mel. It's important for kids to go to school. It's important for their mental health. It's important for their learning and so on. So I would be very reluctant to see us close the schools. I also know it's complicated by the fact there are child care centers located in schools, and so these things are all tied together. So it's not an easy decision. But for myself, I would say that that is an idea very worthy of consideration. I've said so many times to look at having kids go back a little bit later and do some virtual learning early in January.
Okay, Mayor Tory, we are going to jump into that time machine now, and we're going to travel on back to March 2020 when Toronto declared us, I had to look at the date, declaring a state of emergency was March 23rd. It was a week and change prior to that. You were actually on a business mission in London trying to promote the city of Toronto as all of this was happening. If you were to redo that part, would you have went on that business mission?
Oh, yes, because, I think at that time, I think there was not the kind of expectation that this would turn into what it has. There were some people who were saying so, and they'll say I was right, and so on. But I think there was a general sense, and it would tie into, if you had things to do over again, because you could go back in a time machine. I would say that all of us, without exception, me and the Premier, the Prime Minister, I'm not going to speak for them, but I think we would have all said we would have acted faster to do more things faster. But I think there was a general sense that while this was of concern, that it was not going to turn into what it did. In Ontario. There were people who said it would. But having said that, look, my job is to be out selling Toronto, and I left on that trip at a time when the level of concern was there, but it wasn't anywhere near what it is today.
The selling of Toronto, that's going to be interesting moving forward. Obviously, our tourism industry struggling like a number of big cities around the world. Cancellation of some big festivals. The CNE, that got canceled. Pride, Caribbean Carnival, all of them not having a go. And that's going to be hard to rebuild again. So how do you reassure Torontonians and potential visitors to say, hey, we will be open for business when we're ready?
Well, I reassure them mainly by saying this, and I say it all the time because it's true. The good bones, as I call it, that represent what Toronto is, our good values here, where we embrace people, our fabulous smart people, our fabulous system of education, the critical mass we have of industries here, financial services, life sciences, technology. Those are all still here. And we're in a great location near the United States, but in our own independent country. So I just think that Toronto, Canada, and including because of the way in which we've handled the pandemic, relatively speaking, Toronto, Canada is going to be just as attractive, if not more attractive, a place for people to come and live when the borders are open for immigration again. It's going to be a great place to invest and to work and to start businesses and so on. And so I'll get back out selling. The economy has risen back up to be tied with affordable housing at the top of my priority list once we can get through the pandemic. And so I'll be out selling Toronto again, doing it from here. I've been doing it. There are people even that have been calling about investing here while the pandemic's been on. And I've been very happy to be able to sell the city to them. And they know the attractive qualities that we have. So people should have hope about that. It's going to take a while to get back on our feet, but we have all the right fundamentals here. This is a great city, one of the greatest cities in the world, and was one of the fastest growing in the world before the pandemic. And we're going to get back to that just as soon as we can.
You mentioned affordable housing, City Council passing this vacant home tax. Do you have specifics on a rollout on what that could look like?
Yes, it's going to take all of next year to put the administration in place because you have to have a form, for example, that people are going to fill out on their own to say whether the house is vacant or not. There has to be all the administration set up to receive those forms and then to administer the tax. And look, the idea here isn't to raise money. I'd be happy if this tax raised no dollars, zero, only because that would mean that all houses that people own, and I'm happy that people should invest in housing. I want them to. But what we need to establish is the principle that housing is for people to live in and that we can't have a lot of housing that is sitting vacant. And so we will then, though, administer the tax in 2022, and people will be able to write to us and say that the house is occupied. And in Vancouver, the experience was thousands of houses were returned to the rental market because of people not wanting to pay the tax. And then there were other people who made the choice that they wanted to own a house or a condo and keep it vacant, and they paid the tax. So fair enough, but it'll happen in 2022.
Okay, let's talk about some of the money. Looking at a pretty massive shortfall budget-wise for the City of Toronto. There was a significant investment coming from the province yesterday. A lot of that's going to make up for lost revenue from transit, the ridership just not there. How are we looking right now with the books?
Well, for 2020, we're going to be kept whole. In other words, the balanced budget will be achieved thanks to the help from both the federal and provincial governments, because that money that came yesterday is from both governments, and I commend them for stepping up. And it's proof positive that when we work together, as I've tried very hard to do the entire time that I've been mayor, they will support Toronto because it's on the front lines of fighting the pandemic. And for 2021, it's a work in progress. We started off with $1.5 billion shortfall because of reduced transit ridership and reduced parking revenues and all those things. But we've been working very hard, including finding $500 million so far in savings and efficiencies in the city government. And I will just say that I'm going to be working tirelessly through the Christmas period and after to get that budget finalized with our hardworking city staff, and we'll present it in January. And I just think people will know that the hard work that we have done will avoid a big tax increase of any kind whatsoever and avoid big service cuts, because I've been determined from the beginning that those were both things people couldn't bear right now. So we are going to do our job with the help of the other governments to make sure we can provide good services, but do so without big tax increases and without the service cuts.
Could we see potentially, say, a fare increase on the TTC?
No, I mean, again, I'll give you a sneak preview. I mean, I'm going to be talking about the TTC budget today in a media conference, and the fares will be frozen for 2021. And again, this is a reflection of the hard work that the TTC staff have done to maintain services, but to do so without a fare increase. And I got to tell you, in a year like this, that's very hard for us to do because, there are raises that kick in through collective agreement contracts and the fuel prices go up and, different things happen, but they will have maintained service without a fare increase for 2021, which I think is good news for people who use the TTC. And we hope they come back to the TTC because it's also safe.
That is significant. So a fare freeze for 2021, that is good news for ridership. That's indeed. I want to turn from one pandemic to another, and that is what we saw take over our city. And when it comes to social injustice, systemic racism, we saw a number of Torontonians take to the streets for the Black Lives Matter movement. Anti-Black racism, as we know, is prevalent in our city, and anyone who says it isn't is turning a blind eye. Now, as all of this is happening, you have the chief of police who resigns or retires early. and we bring in Chief Raymer as an interim chief. There is a lot to unpackage here. Let's start first with the recommendations. I know there were a number of reports and recommendations that need to be implemented when it comes to changes made within our police services. So let's rehash that and see where we're going from here.
Well, I mean, the main thing is that the demonstrations, which, by the way, were peaceful compared to many other cities where that wasn't the case, and I commend people for getting out and getting engaged in that manner, and I think it prompted us to move forward with a list of, I think it's 81 different recommendations, some of which have been implemented. The police budget for the first time, line by line, detail by detail, is now online. The Auditor General is coming in to have a look at policing, and there are different things like that that have been done. The Mobile Crisis Intervention Team, which helps respond to calls coming from people in distress. That is being taken 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the first time. We're working on developing a response mechanism for people in crisis that entirely consists of mental health professionals and doesn't involve the police. So there's a lot of things happening, and it does stem from an acknowledgement that I made a couple of years ago that there is anti-Black racism in Toronto, period, full stop. And we set up the first in North America anti-Black racism unit inside the city government that's been working since then. So I think Toronto is well positioned to be a leader in making change and reform, which will restore trust in policing. And that's what we're all working very hard to do on those 81 recommendations as we speak.
Yesterday, it was the largest single-day recovery of drugs and guns for the Toronto Toronto Police Service, I should say. So I commend Toronto Police on this and getting some of these elements off of our streets. But I do want to talk about gun violence in our city. I know some federal dollars were promised back then. Where does all of that stand? Has any of that been given to us, and what are we doing with it?
The federal money was confirmed, and I'm very happy about that. And I commend the federal government again for keeping an election promise, $50 million a year for 5 years nationally, and we will get our share of that. And we will then decide in consultation with community organizations how to best put it to work, because I think we have work to do. I've been hearing from people that we don't get that money down, far enough to the grassroots. And so we'll do that. The police budget for this year, which is coming in at zero, nonetheless provides for an expansion of neighborhood policing, which I think will be very good to have people walking through the neighborhoods as opposed to police cars coming with sirens and lights going only in response to a bad event and all that sort of thing. And Chief Jim Raymer, who you made reference to earlier, he is doing a great job at that, as well as actually fighting the gun violence you're talking about, so that by the end of the year, we had a bad patch in the middle of the year. By the end of the year, we're on track to actually have the number of shootings this year go down on a year-over-year basis. The number of homicides go down, and the number of injuries and deaths from shooting this year so far are down 21% over last year. So while you hear different talk during the summer, and it was certainly warranted when we had a bad period there, the overall results for the year are actually going to be an improvement, and we've just got to keep that going. Most of that, I think, is going to happen because we invest in kids and families and neighborhoods with some of this federal money and more of our own. And I intend to see that forward because that's very important for us to keep the city safe with our police, who do such a fantastic job for us. They really do. There are problems sometimes with police officers and things that happen that are not good, but I think by and large they keep us safe and they do a good job for us. And I think it's worthy of note at this time of year that they do, as well as the fire and the ambulance too. These first responders work day in and day out. You see the fires and you see the ambulances going by, and they just do a fantastic job for us, all the time.
Especially this year. It's been a challenging one for everyone, including them. Mayor Tory, this ends this portion of this interview, but I want to say thank you again. And are you ready for part two?
I'm never completely ready for it, but I steel myself every morning not knowing what they're going to pull on me today. But anyway.
Okay, here we go.
Mel,
here's Dina and Diva.
Happy holidays. Okay.
Happy holidays.